So welcome everybody. This is January 3rd, 2009, and all of us will be writing 8 instead of 9 for a while, although I tried writing the new year in about 6 months ago and realized I was perhaps anticipating 2009. So welcome to all of you, and this is a teleconference on Pathwork Guide Lecture 143, Unity and Duality. And again, I'm going to talk about it for a while, but I welcome your questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and speak up and we'll deal with them at the time. The lecture on unity and duality is key to understanding the pathwork. And the reason for that is that on a spiritual perspective, we look at things differently than we do on an earthly or dualistic perspective. So I'm going to describe this in terms of 3 spheres. And this is a teaching that's called the 50-50 or the keys teaching. And it just helps to differentiate different ways of describing outlooks. So the first plane would be the dualistic plane, and that's the plane that we understand from a child ego perspective. And we're getting a lot of feedback here. If somebody could mute their phone, that might help. Let me see. Muting is if you hit *6. Yeah, because we're getting a lot of feedback there. Okay, so the dualistic plane is the plane that we work from a child consciousness, from a human ego perspective. And it is the perspective that seems most natural and normal to us. So on a dualistic plane, we look at things from a personal perspective, or the perspective of our family, our village, our nation, but a point of view that is very narrow, which basically says it's either my way or your way, either I get it or you get it, it's right or wrong, it's good or bad. So the term we're going to use for that for just a moment is an individual self-sphere. And if you can imagine it, it's as if you're in a little bubble by yourself and you're looking at the universe from that perspective, even if there are others in the bubble with you. Okay, so that would be on the dualistic plane. The unitive plane is described in the lecture as being the place of our divine center, the place of our higher self, our higher perspective, the spirit sphere where God exists, where all exists. So on the dualistic plane, back in the bubble, you have the illusion that one choice excludes another. So if I do this, then I can't do that. So the key word here is or. And another way of describing that is saying 100-100. It's 100% this way, or it's 100% that way. Okay? In the unitive plane, there is no or because we're in oneness. And all choices are possible. And the reason for that is that there is no time. So time is an element of duality. On the unitive plane, time does not exist, or it exists in a way that is different for us here on Earth. So that's where you can get the and. Because somebody may have it at the moment, but you may have it later. You may lack something right now, but you may have it at a different time. The dilemma is that from a human perspective, that could be another lifetime. From a unitive perspective, I'm teasing a little bit, but so what? It's another lifetime, but you'll get it eventually. Okay? So another way of describing the unitive plane is to say all rather than or 100 rather than 100-100, my way, your way. So that leaves us with what do you do with that? You've got a very limited, narrow reality, and you've got the unitive reality, which is is huge, and we can't really exist there. And the lecture says that we don't exist in the unitive plane, we exist on a dualistic plane. So on the earth, you fall down, go boom, and you get a cut on your knee. And there's an illusion of pain, and that illusion is very, very strong. It's real. So I want to use the term real life because we have to deal with these realities. We die on the planet Earth. We don't die as a spirit, but we die on the planet Earth. So again, on the unitive plane, all choices are possible. We are all one. It's all open, and there is no division of good, bad, right, wrong. But on the dualistic plane, on the plane of real life, the illusion is very strong that you do have to make such choices. So Pathwork describes a middle way. Okay, and I use that term out of respect and fondness for the Buddhist middle way, and I think that all great philosophies teach a similar philosophy. So in the middle way, what Pathwork is trying to show us is a way where we can sense into the unitive plane, while we do still have to deal with the dualities of the planet Earth, with the dualities of being a human being. So from the middle way, what we can find is an and, rather than all or. So in the middle way, we find that some choices do exclude in the moment, in our perception. And some choices do include. So another way of describing this is a term called 50-50. And what that means is sometimes I win and sometimes I lose, sometimes I get it and sometimes I don't. But it gives the impression that there's always another chance. It's like playing baseball and saying, well, I struck out, but I come up in the rotation again, so I'll have another chance at bat. So another way of describing this would be sometimes or maybe, without excluding the possibility, but in accepting the realities of human life. Okay, so in human life, either you have the ice cream cone or you don't. You don't have a phantom ice cream cone, and if you share it with everybody, your taste buds will not enjoy it. So there is a real life, a reality, that if you give something to someone, you may not have that full experience on a sensory level. And from a child's perspective, that means I didn't get the ice cream. From the middle way, where we sent into the unitive, what the lecture is trying to say is, not trying to say, sorry about that, what the lecture is saying, is that if you hand someone else your ice cream, we all get it. That the pleasure that another receives is shared on some level with all of us. So while there is a loss perhaps of human sensory experience, it's not because you don't get the ice cream. And I'm using a tiny example because this is where the work actually occurs, is on a very, very, very tiny level. We can all see the larger examples. They're right and wrong. We can understand that something's not totally wrong, but we understand that we have to do something about it. But the distortions of daily life usually are reflected in very banal and very small moments. In the place where we don't want to share because we believe that we will go without if we do. So what I'm describing is the dualistic plane, and one group's term for that is the individual self-sphere, and I always imagine it as being in a little bubble all by myself. And the unitive, where there is no division, no bubble, and we are all together. And then the middle way, and one way of describing that would be that there's a larger bubble that includes all of us. But the word bubble, the reason I'm using the word bubble is we still have to deal with consequences. We just still have to deal with reality. We're not completely clear and free on the unitive plane yet. We're still dealing with the planet Earth. And I say that because I'm a human being talking to other human beings, and part of being in that 50-50 reality is understanding that while I hold human form, my intellect and my understanding may be limited. So the next question becomes, why? Why would we be limited? And that goes back to the fact that we have a spiritual task to perform here on the earth. And not just one, but a multitude of spiritual tasks. So I'm just going to list some. One of our tasks is to learn to address the dualistic plane, the real life issues of life and death, right and wrong, mine, not mine, yours, not mine. To differentiate between the real life issues and the deeper truths. So to not become deceived by the momentary void, by the momentary not having, and to learn to understand that there is a having on a different plane, but if we want to have it on an earth plane, action may need to be taken. Now, the question would be, why did we invent the dualistic plane? And I say we, because we are co-creating this. We have come here to perform a spiritual task, so there is some kind of contract between all of us. And one of the reasons that we're all here is to work to bring in a higher consciousness, to grow, and to transform and purify our distortions. So the next thing I'm going to describe is, what's a distortion? And this is where the two things come together, our spiritual task and the illusion, the harsh illusions of this planet, come together precisely so we can see what beliefs we hold that are narrow and not in the unitive. So rather than stay in the conceptual there, I want to work with what does this look like in real life. So when we work with the concepts of unity and duality, unity is, I want to say it's easy because it's everything, okay? And it's very hard, once again, to live with that, to live on that plane except for a few moments because we're real, we get tired, we get hungry. So when we work with duality, one of the key ways you can figure out if you're dealing with a dualistic attitude or concept is that if you crank up the contrast and you can discern where one choice equals life and the other choice equals death. Now, I didn't mention this in the materials I put out, but what I found was one of the great lectures to work with unity and duality is lecture 81, which is conflicts in the world of duality. And that focuses on how key to our life is the illusion of death, death in human format. So taking that, if you take a look at something you're avoiding or something you want or a conflict or a disharmony in your life, and you crank up the contrast, you have to exaggerate a little bit, use a bit of hyperbole, and you figure out what is life. You can always assume that what you're attracted to is life. And I'll explain in a moment that that may be in distortion, but if you're attracted to it, you are perceiving it as life. And that leaves the thing you're running away from representing death. So if you take a sheet of paper or in your mind, just run up 2 columns, and you put life at the top of one column and death at the top of the other column. And you start listing things down. You can play for a bit, and you can write under life, right, and under death, wrong. And then under life, now. And under death, you can put not now. But the truth is, what we're afraid of is that not now will turn into never. And that's what I mean by cranking up the contrast. Our intellect may understand, and somebody was saying this before we started, that intellectually we may be able to grasp that we can have dessert later. But there is a part of our consciousness that is a little nervous about whether if we went to the fridge later, somebody might have eaten our dessert. So not now always has the specter behind it, like some grim ghost of never. Pleasure is always life-affirming. And pain or displeasure would, of course, be death. But again, this is tricky because what we can avoid sometimes is not just pain, but a lack of pleasure. Again, what happens is from our child consciousness, we become afraid that if we don't have pleasure, and a lot of it, then what we're left with is unpleasure. But that's going to descend very quickly into awful, into pain, into not having any pleasure at all. So again, we're looking at the contrast. On the life side would be control, organizing our environment, ordering our lives. And on the death side might be chaos. Now I say might because for some people, order can be perceived as being controlled by others. So the kid, or the kid that grows into, the kid that grows up into an adult who lives in a messy house may be living in that messy home because they perceive the freedom to not put things away as life. And they may perceive a neat environment as death, as being controlled to a place where their creativity can't flourish and that they're not allowed to be who they might want to be or think they are, where they have to be defined so absolutely that they feel like that's death. So when we look at these things, and when I started, what I said was you need to look at what you're attracted to or what you have manifested and you can't seem to change. So if you have manifested a messy home, you may want to look at your concepts around order, your feelings around what that means to you. Because what you may find is, even though it doesn't sound logical and you may not be able to defend it to people or sound like you're a grown-up, a mature grown-up, because your place is always a mess, from the perspective that we're talking about here, a messy house can symbolize life, freshness, creativity, spontaneity. And a neat house can represent death. So when somebody goes towards something, what I said was you can always assume that something that you're attracted to represents life. But it is because there are distortions in there that you can become attracted to something that is actually destructive. One of the examples I use is Romeo and Juliet, because usually everybody knows the story. And the reason I use it is that if you understand the story from their perspective, what these two young people were saying is that life as presented to us is death. We'd rather take our chances. We'd rather roll the dice and go into the life beyond than live in life as our parents are dictating it to us. So they weren't trying to die. On an energetic spiritual level, they were trying to live. And that's how deeply you have to go into your own personal story and your own personal feelings when you work on this. You can't take cliche examples from society, because that's an average. Average society might think that you should drive on the correct side of the road and put your things away and keep your clothes clean. But what an individual does is very unique to their particular point of view, perspective, and even their spiritual task. So another example that I was looking at was, it's because we've gone through the Christmas season, and most people I know have watched It's a Wonderful Life a gazillion times. What I noticed when I caught the little segment the other night of the movie is that the character in that film wants to die because he believes that his family would be better off without him. So while he may die, he is extending himself, actually going into the middle way and saying, but my family would have the respect of the town if I wasn't here, because I can't handle the bank situation. And my family would be happy, and they might get cared for, and my wife might find somebody who is better able to support her and take care of her. So if I remove myself from the picture, the people that I love can live happier, more fulfilling lives. So it is in this distortion, he sees his death as life-affirming. And what the film does is it shows him that his family would rather have him with all the shame and embarrassment and difficulty of the bank mistake than to not have him, and that so would his town. And once he sees that, then he switches sides, because he was seeking life on a deep level of truth and meaning. So when we are attracted to something and we perceive it in our intellect as destructive and say, why am I attracted to that? Why am I going there? One of the things you can do is sit down with a 2-column list and play with it and put down all the words that come to you, all the feelings that come to you about what you're attracted to. And then you can either simply list the opposite words and start noticing if there's a pattern. So that's one of the ways to work with duality. And you will have to exaggerate a little bit, because these are not easy to find. And the last point I wanted to make on this theme is that there are two reasons, there are two ways to go into duality, explained in the lecture. One is to actually believe mine, not mine, good, bad, life, death, to really absorb that and fear the other choice. But the other one, interestingly enough, is that you can go into dualistic thinking by having an attachment to unity. Now that's paradoxical, but basically what it says is, once you say that the unitive sphere is best, to some degree you're negating the very fact that you were born as a human being. So while it may sound positive, you know, God is in his place and the spirit world is grand and that's what I want, you got born here, you have a life here, and so you meant to do something here. And by negating that and claiming that the unitive is the only place to go, you are actually falling into dualistic thinking. That as human beings, the only thing that we may be able to maintain over long periods of time is that middle way. The sense that there is a bubble, that we're all in this together, that there are a lot of illusions, that they may not be real, that we may become nervous or upset or frightened and fall off the tracks sometimes, but that we have opportunities to get back on track. And that is what human beings are here to learn. And the guide's words for that are that we are here to transform and purify our negativities. One of the thoughts that came up while I was trying to figure out how to present this is, in analogy, if you read The Spiritual Meaning of Relationship, lecture 180, what that lecture says is that we go into personal, intimate relationship for the purpose of bringing up our distortions. That is the purpose of relationship. Rather than the purpose being to be happy or the purpose being to succeed, on a spiritual plane, the purpose of going into a relationship is to bring these things up and purge. And when you are in a relationship with someone else, you get irritated, you get angry. In the most intimate places of your being, you find another person who is not perfect, and this irritates, and the friction, and it's like a grain of sand in your eye. It brings out your wrath. It brings out your selfishness. All the things that you need to work on will come out in an intimate relationship. To some degree, we are all in intimate relationship with each other, and we are in intimate relationship with the earth plane. So the earth plane itself can bring up our distortions. It can make us angry. It can show us where intellectually we say, I think patience is a wonderful thing, but we start drumming our fingers every time we don't get what we want on time. So again, in the smallest aspects of life, that's where we find out the truth about ourselves. So if intellectually you say, I know that God is a wonderful being and that the creation is perfect and everything is great, then the only way for you to find out that you are not completely there is for you to look at your distortions. And the way you find your distortions is to look at where you have disharmonious situations. So conflict is where we work. Pleasure is our birthright. Pleasure, the guide uses the phrase pleasure supreme in either 81 or 143. I think it's 81. And it's a lovely phrase. And what he says is that part of our problem is that we remember. We remember pleasure supreme, and we want it desperately. So there can become an intolerance to the fact that on this earth, the mail is late, or they lost something, or my shoelace comes untied, or it breaks, or the egg is burned, or all the things in life that aren't perfect. They may be an illusion. The egg doesn't exist, and neither does the pan, but the fact is my breakfast is ruined. And now I need to go out and do what I need to do, and I've got hunger. I feel hunger in my body, and it will irritate me, and it could distract me from what I'm doing. This is what life is supposed to be about. It's not that that's a mistake. The guide even says very many places that every single thing in life is perfect. It was designed to a level of perfection that we would find very difficult to grasp. So here's how I use that, going off track a little bit. When I am driving, I'm kind of notorious for taking the wrong direction. I'm left-handed and I do right instead of left, and so I'm constantly making the wrong turn. And it's irritating, it's embarrassing. People laugh at me and they say, the other left, Jan. And I get lost, and of course you get off at the wrong exit and you spend 15 minutes trying to get back on the road again. And so I play a game with myself on that little tiny flaw in my personality. And the game I play is, I wonder why it was important for me to get off that road, since I do not know what is happening on the road at the moment. I wonder if I avoided a nail or avoided an accident, or I just needed to decompress. I was going in a straight line, I was rushing, so this got me off track and gave me a breather. And you just get back on the road again. But what I try to do is understand that if every single thing is important, if everything, it's not that it's orchestrated, we're not talking about fate, we're not talking about your life being structured to the nth degree. What I'm referring to is that everything matters. So even taking the wrong turn has some meaning. I may not be able to figure it out, but what I'm describing is I have tried not to become aggravated about it. I've tried to laugh at it and go the left-right thing and try to figure out how I got the instructions wrong so that I don't do it again. And enjoy the turns as I go back and forth on the road trying to find the way back onto the main road again. And that by not becoming aggravated by that, my personal experience is I make fewer wrong turns. So what I'm describing is that in the lecture on unity and duality, the simplest element of life can teach you something about yourself. It can teach you that you think that making a wrong turn is death, that it embarrasses you, that it shows how stupid you are, that it wastes your time, that if you're late something terrible will happen. And while some of those elements may be true, less is true than you may believe. And so by exploring the territories that you thought were death, you may become less attached to the things in the column of life, and you may find that 50-50 place. Sometimes I'm late, and people don't always mind, sometimes they do, and I need to learn when things really matter, when it's important not to be late, and for that I need to give myself extra time. This is what we go through as mature adults. We learn that there are some occasions where we can be late and some occasions where it's important not to be late, and that extra care needs to be taken. So these are just some examples of learning to see within ourselves aspects of dualistic thinking. And it is more important to understand dualistic thinking than to attack a particular thing. Because if you can't see the split, if you can't see the life-death split that your mind makes, then you can get hung up on details, such as, he told me not to be late, and he told me I'd lose the job if I was late, and therefore you go into that with rationale, and you won't see where you bought into the dualism. That on time means everything, and being late is death. So I think I've run that analogy into the ground at this point. Does anybody have any questions? Sometimes you do. It just can't be helped. Does anybody have any questions?
I do. I have a question, and that is, I follow the analogy perfectly, but my mind, as you were talking, I was thinking of my own, there are mistakes in some way, and in the maybe perfected mistakes, but we see them as mistakes.
Uh-huh.
Making a wrong turn in a car is easily forgivable.
Mm-hmm.
Making the wrong decision in a job or moving to another country or a wrong relationship, those are greater lessons and harder lessons. It seems to me the middle way is about forgiveness. So to stay in the middle way, you forgive yourself for the right and the wrong, and with that softness, with that forgiveness, it's easier to stay in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
I see a fine line between the middle way and forgiveness, because then duality becomes less definable, because there is a chance to do it again. So it isn't life and death. It's whoops. But is that clear?
Yes. Yes, and I would agree. And I think that we all have ways of expressing this, and I accept that the way you're expressing it is similar to what I'm trying to express.
Yeah, the middle way is an interesting concept, really.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the small examples, the reason I do that is, number one, they can be humorous, and secondly, it's always easy to rationalize or justify that missing a plane flight or losing a job is going to kill us.
Well,
okay.
And sometimes it does on the physical plane. I mean, not kill us literally, but can the cause or the effects that come from making those decisions truly erupt our lives. So we're to look at it and say, but even that is orchestrated. orchestrated, even that eruption, there was a purpose and a meaning to have gone through that. I mean, they're big extremes from making a wrong turn on a highway to making a wrong turn in the bigger picture of your life. I mean, there's a big jump there from one to the other.
So my challenge to you would be, is there such a big jump?
Yeah.
Because I want to look at the phrasing of you do get killed if you lose a job, or you can die if you lose a job. That's a fear, and there's always the tabloid story, okay, that someone lost of getting shot on the job, or jumping off a bridge, or there's always a tabloid story to justify our rationalizations. Okay, but sincerely, how do you die when you don't get a job or if you lose a job? That particular that's not like getting shot as a bank teller. We're not talking about losing your job because you died.
Yeah, no.
Okay, we're talking about losing your job leading to death. And what this lecture is about is that that's exactly the conjoining that we have done, that we have made losing a job equal to death. When it's not. It's just not. It does mean...
It just leads to the next adventure.
Right. So it does mean that you are now in the unknown. It does mean that you're now going to be walking the pavement. It does mean that you're going to have to dust up your resume. It does mean that you're going to have to be creative about your finances, and you're going to have to take a good hard look at your life. It may mean that you have to compromise where you live. It may mean you have to compromise on the next job because you didn't voluntarily plan to change jobs. It came at you quite suddenly. But this is not death, this is change. And what this lecture is talking about is we have equated the unknown and change with death. That's what we've done. And once you get that you have done that, then you can begin to see that the terrible thing that you would like to avoid is not death. Gulp. You have to take a breath when you say that. Okay? So, in the tiniest examples to the biggest examples, look at all the people who have lost their fortunes. Look at people who have lost their professions. Look at people who have lost their families. Now that has got to feel like emotional death.
Oh, I would imagine.
Okay. But the reality is, it's not death. It feels like death, and it is a death. It is a change.
Hey, Jan?
Yeah.
Okay, on the same concept, there's a number of lectures in which the guide brings up this idea that if you resist, if you want to say, the flow of your life, it can lead to, and I'll say in quotes, crisis, which, you know, as you're talking about losing your job, which happened to me, as a side note, 3 or 4 times, where I thought, you know, it was going to be the end of the world, and saw that it always turned out to be for the best. But, so where you're talking about this not fearing change, can you talk a little bit, you know what I'm talking about, where you talk about how you interrupted your life as a way to, if you're kind of avoiding?
So the joke is there's a lecture on every topic, and the classic lecture, there's 2 classic lectures on this topic. One is the spiritual meaning of crisis.
Yeah, okay.
The other one is a lecture called The Anatomy of Contraction.
Okay.
And what both of the lectures talk about is the fact that when you are in stasis, when you are stuck, something's got to happen. And that crisis basically represents when you can't stay where you are and you are not able to keep the life flow moving so that you can move through it or out of it. So what happens is, I like to use the word deconstruction rather than destruction. So as you say, and I've experienced this too, I have lost jobs and it has been very painful and very difficult and gone through all kinds of, and found out that the freedom that that gave me, I was able to go much, much further in life than I would have if I'd stayed in that one place. So the question the lecture is asking is, why? Why do you want to stay in that one place? What are you afraid of?
Right.
What is your imagination building here? So if you sit down with the columns and you say, well, here I have a steady income and I know I'm going to be employed for X amount of time and I know where the bathrooms are and I know who the people are and I'm comfortable and I feel at ease and therefore I feel I can do my job better. Those are all life affirming. We're not arguing with the life affirming. But the interesting thing is to see what you put on the other side of the paper. For instance, I don't like strangers. I feel awkward around strangers. When I take a new job, it takes me forever to get to know people. And during that time period, it affects my work. I don't work as well as I feel I can. To some degree, losing a job gives you more practice at taking on new job situations, so that over time, losing several jobs can actually break you free. Can you see where the one, even though it is life-affirming, has actually become calcified and has become duality? So the lecture is not saying, don't move towards life. It's saying that a movement towards life, because you're afraid of what's behind you, is not actually an affirmation of life. It's a fear of death. Now, if you move towards life and there are no distortions and no disharmonies and no conflicts, then go ahead. You're probably moving towards life. But the situations that we're dealing with are where conflicts and disharmonies come up. And in those situations, what the guide is suggesting is that despite your best intentions, you may have gone into dualistic thinking and limited your perspective and actually have an either-or mentality. And this is not going to bring in the power of the unitive. I remember at one point in the lectures, the guide says that there is enough food for everyone on the planet. And I think I'm paraphrasing here, but what I got from that is that it is our fear of scarcity that creates the scarcity. That if everybody on the planet shared the food, that it's very likely there would be enough food to keep everyone alive. But it might not keep my tummy full as often as I have gotten used to my tummy being full. And if we share everything, we may have to make some choices that will preclude one of my favorite fruits. So for the sake of my having my favorite fruit in the refrigerator at all time, to some extent that duality of saying, I must have this, or I have the right to have it, or I won't be happy without it, I may be influencing on an energetic and spiritual level, not turning over that orchard or that land to the production of foods that would be more easily shared on the planet. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So what I'm describing is that in the place where a disharmony occurs, the lecture is suggesting that we look at whether we are in dualistic thinking about this. And that when we are in unitive thought, when we are accessing our deeper truth, when we are accessing our real self, that these disharmonies move away. So there was a mention before about forgiveness. Yes, forgiving yourself for your flaws, forgiving yourself for being human, forgiving yourself for being imperfect, accepting that imperfections happen, mistakes happen, and moving on with the presumption that there's a reason for everything, and you may not understand it yet, but you'll find it eventually.
And that you're not going to die.
Right. Now, like I say, I call them tabloid examples because the tabloids will tell you that everything's going to kill you, and everything's going to destroy your home. And I know somebody got on, started sending me emails about cleaning the lint cleaner in my dryer because it would burst into flame. Now, I understand that that happened on an occasion, but I want to draw a distinction between that happening in one freak occurrence and my laying in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning going, oh my God, I didn't clean the lint. I've got to wake up and rush downstairs and clean the lint out of my dryer. There's a distinction between unique and special occurrences and living a life filled with fear. In the unitive plane, if my house burns down, maybe I needed that. From a unitive perspective, why else would my house burn down? And that's the essence in the spiritual meaning of crisis. What the guide is presenting is very revolutionary compared to a lot of thought patterns that society instills in us. The guide is saying that we are co-creators. The guide is saying that if your house burns down, no one did it to you. It happened. And it has value for you as a spirit to deal with it. And in other places, what the guide is saying is that if your house burning down is not in your highest good, somehow you might get a little singed, but your house won't completely burn down. I want to draw a very, very strong line between a spiritual perspective of things and basically saying that we do these things to ourselves. That's not what I'm saying. So I want to be very generous and understanding of the hardships that people face on a day-to-day basis. I am addressing from a spiritual perspective different ways of dealing with those hardships so that we don't feel bad about ourselves or so we don't blame other people. The other person may have done it. That may be absolutely true. But there is a distinction between recognizing that someone torched my house and they need to be found and arrested. I need to stand on the witness. We need to go through all these things. And feeling that I'm bad because my house burned down. That's the distinction we're making here. So if, I'm going to go with this for a second. So if your house is burnt and you lose everything, you do what you have to do. You do the insurance, you do the, you take care of real life matters. And then take a look at what this means to you. Do you really feel naked and bereft? Do you feel like you have no value now that you have no home? Even if you had no insurance, even if you have to struggle in life. What could be a spiritual lesson here for you to take with you? Because the house is gone, you might as well get a spiritual lesson out of it. Does that answer your question? Might not have been a question.
Jan, I guess maybe it's a follow-on. I'm right now working with lesson 235.
Okay.
And 235 talks. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm getting some static.
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Maybe when you take the break, I'll switch to a home phone.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking it might be like the cell phone's about to die or something. Okay, anyhow, so in 235, the guy talks about the concepts of perfection, immortality, and omnipotence. And I'm just listening to you, and I'm kind of chuckling because I feel like a lot of it is in alignment with what he talks about in that lecture, in that, let me see if I can paraphrase it, the idea that, you know, like you were saying, this, we want things to be perfect, but in a human consciousness sense, and missing the greater, if you would say, the divine level or the unitive level of perfection, where, and I mean, this is an extreme, I wouldn't, you just were talking about burning down the house, that, you know, maybe the house burned down because now you're going to go move to some place that you're really supposed to be, sort of thing, and that's that greater level of perfection. This is, I guess, what I'm starting to try and get, and unfortunately, you know, I've got all these little examples of my life of, okay, seems like that may not be the best thing, but perhaps that prevents me from doing something else.
Well, that's true. In other words, there's a lot of choices out there. What I'm suggesting is that when one door is closed, if you find that it cannot be opened again, that we move on. Now, it's a personal choice as to whether you want to bang on that door a lot, or if you want to do something about it, or go around. These are personal life decisions, and they have to do with the development of ourselves as spirits. So there is no right or wrong answer. But once a door is closed to you and you cannot get it open again, is it possible, the guide asks, is it possible that there is a place you can go that you would not have gone except for that door having been closed?
Right.
Again, I want to distinguish between the reality and the fact that somebody else did that. And I'm simply saying, from the point where the door is closed, what is possible? Now, you could translate this into affirmations and feel-good stuff and say, well, yeah, just be happy, just go on. But the guide is talking about something deeper. He's talking about an examination of our deep-held attitudes. So there's a lot of static. Whoops. Hesitate a second. Okay, so there's a lot of static on the line. If somebody could mute themselves, cell phones sometimes do that. So picking up again, I found two quotes in the lecture that I think work well at this point. And this has to do with the fact that what we're talking about here is really changing our attitude more than anything else. And the quote is from Lecture 143. When the road to the unified principle is chosen, soon what first appeared as one good and one bad ceases to be so, and one inevitably encounters good and bad on both ends. And when this road is pursued still further, there is no longer any bad, but only good. The road leads deep inside into the real self, into truth that surpasses the fearful little ego interests. This simple act of wanting the truth requires several factors, the most important of which is the willingness to relinquish what one holds on to, whether this be a belief, a conviction, a fear, a cherished way of being. When I say relinquish, I merely mean questioning it and being willing to see that there is something else beyond this outlook and that conviction. So what those two paragraphs are pointing towards, that I wanted to open up the discussion to, is that good and bad are very commonly narrow perceptions. Okay, it's good for the next 4 or 5 years, but perhaps after 50 years or 100 years, it's not so good. It doesn't have an overwhelmingly good affect. And something that is bad for a period of time, against 50 or 100 years into the future, may not be so bad. Now, I'm not talking about letting oil wells spill oil all over the planet. But even if you took that kind of simplistic and dramatic example, every time a major oil spill has occurred, things do get done. They may not be done quickly. They may not be done as well as some people think they ought to be done. But action gets taken because people get angry. So the spill itself, while you could label that bad, may produce a long-term good in that people become more aware of the beauty that was destroyed and take more care in preserving it, so that 50, 100 years later, you have fewer and fewer oil spills. So again, what we're talking about, what the guide is talking about here, is bad and good are not absolute. Now the second section that he's talking about has to do with attitude. So in this attitude, the holding on to a cherished belief, any holding on of any kind, it must develop into dualistic thinking, because if this is so important that I cannot let go of it, the other thing must be a threat. And in terms of attitude, anytime you feel this, what the guide is suggesting is that you look at the other side, really deeply look at the other side, and see whether it is what you perceive it to be. Because by saying yes to this and no to that, you're in dualistic thinking. This is different from saying, yes, I have a preference for this. Yes, this is what I want to support. This is where I want to be. This is what I want to be doing. And if I find myself in another situation, I'm going to take action so I come back to this place again. That's the attitude that the guide is inviting you to develop. Now there's another place in the lectures where this is discussed, and I remember it because I had trouble with it. And that's the first stage of the stages of commitment, which are listed as AD6 in the additional materials. And this is question number 5. And question number 5 it's a different way of phrasing it that I think speaks very clearly. And question number 5 says, if you feel threatened in the process of removing a fixed prejudice, are you willing to understand the dynamics behind this fear in the process of your pathwork, even before you may actually dare give up the prejudice or fixed belief in question? Now, what I find humorous about that question is that in formal programs, when there's going to be a commitment ceremony and you're looking at whether or not you want to take a stage of commitment, inevitably, this is understood as if you believe in something, you've got to give it up. That's the translation. Okay? But that's not what it says. It says, if you feel threatened in the process of removing a fixed prejudice. And right there is the key. If you see a prejudice in your thinking pattern and you consider changing it, and that makes you feel threatened, there's dualistic thinking going on here. And what the stages of commitment are about is asking you, would you be willing to look at it?
There's a lot of static and you're completely gone.
Okay, so I'm going to start over that bit. And yes, if somebody is on a cell phone or if there's noise in the background, if you could mute with a *6.
Okay, terrible.
Okay, let's hope. Thank you, Dory. I was aware of it, but I wasn't certain how much it was affecting other people, so I didn't know whether to stop or not. So let me start over.
Go ahead.
Let me go back a bit. The phrase from the stages of commitment is, if you feel threatened in the process of removing a fixed prejudice. Okay? So the presumption is that you know that there's a prejudice, there's some place where you're holding on. And in the process of taking a look at it, you feel threatened. The stage of commitment here is saying, would you be willing to look at it? Not give it up, not let it go, but would you be willing to look at what's going on? Rather than when you feel threatened, simply hold on tighter. That's really what this lecture is about. That without realizing it, dualistic thinking becomes mine, mine, like the seagulls in Nemo, Finding Nemo, with beautiful onomatopoetic interpretation of seagulls crying, is mine. Anytime that you grab something and you say, if I give this up, all will be lost, you're in dualistic thinking. And the reason I pick tiny examples is that it is in the tiny examples that our dualistic thinking begins to build up. In other words, if we're calcifying, if we're beginning to build up a position, it's not going to build up overnight into, I don't like vanilla ice cream, or I don't like people from this continent, or it's not going to show up right there. It will show up in very, very subtle ways over long periods of time, so that when we finally make the last step into dualistic thinking, it sounds rational, it sounds reasonable, and it is supported by a lot of other choices we make. And that's why when I work with people, you can hit the big things, and that's very, very important, but the big things are made up of little things. Okay, the big stuff is made up of 1,000 dualistic decisions. So that when you finally say, I won't do this because that is dangerous or wrong or scary, you don't even see it as dualistic. That's only reasonable. But when you go back down to, I want to hold the job because it makes me, I'm comfortable where I am and I don't want to change, that could be more true than you might realize. I remember I went through one year, I got fired 3 times. It was very painful, and I felt very bad about it. But in the rest of my life, I've never been afraid of being fired, because I got it 3 times. I learned how to handle being fired. It doesn't kill you. So it does disrupt, and it is painful, and you got to find another job. But I can't explain it. I was just never terrified of being fired again. It was just part of my reality. Sometimes you get fired, sometimes you don't. Just like, actually, I was an employer also, and when people said, I want to talk to you, I was always terrified that they were going to give me notice. Because if you think about it, the employer can fire you, or you can fire the employer. And they are sometimes just as afraid of being fired by you as you are by them. And it was hard for me when somebody said, we have to talk. I didn't know where they were coming from. I wanted to gain the advantage. I wanted to feel secure. I had no idea what they were talking about. Instead of saying, what do you want to talk about? What is your need that you have finally brought to me? Thank goodness, so now we can discuss it and see if I can meet your needs. From a unitive place, if I cannot meet your needs as an employer, I should encourage you to go on. From a unitive place, if I cannot meet the needs of my lover, love would dictate that I release them and encourage them and support them in moving on. And if you take the unitive attitude towards yourself, it's not that I'm bad, but it may be true that I, in my life circumstance, with the choices that I have made, am not able to meet that person's needs. I can see where we've got an irrevocable conflict here. But when you take a dualistic point of view, which is, you're not giving me enough time to explain myself, and you like other women better than, that's dualistic. People leave relationships for a variety of reasons, but if someone chooses to go, it is not necessarily because you've done anything wrong. Sometimes both of you have outgrown the relationship. These are the different attitudes that you can cultivate by taking a more unitive perspective than a dualistic perspective. So, are there any other questions? I always ask that with great fear, because if there are no questions, I don't know what to do. And sometimes, as big as this lecture is, that's about all I can help with. Let me say this. 143, Unity and Duality, if you get that, you get all the lectures. There isn't a single lecture where the guide is not talking about dualistic attitudes creating conflict and a unitive attitude dissipating that conflict or offering you another perspective, another opportunity. So normally I don't teach this by itself because I teach it in little tiny drops throughout all the other lectures. Yes?
Yeah, sorry, it took me, a few seconds to get the phone unmuted. So I do have a question for you. So I guess one of the things I'm wrestling with as I continue to work with these concepts is that fine line between when are you trying to force things, and that's been one of my things is to try and force stuff, versus when are you allowing things to flow and recognizing that, nope, this isn't really for me anymore, this is the place I'm supposed to be, versus when is it, well, I need to just try a little harder. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So,
okay, 'cause I still wrestle with that quite a bit.
So the key, there's two keys in this. One is that anytime you do something out of fear, there's a very good possibility that you're in dualistic thinking, even if you're making the right choice. You see, just because you do something out of fear doesn't mean you're not right. And by right, I mean appropriate decision under the circumstances. The problem is that when fear prompts us to make certain decisions, by the 102nd decision, we seem to think that fear is a good indicator of what not to do. So we actually embrace fear. We bring it on board as an advisor. I've made 102 decisions, and every time I walked away from fear and into something else, it was a positive thing. But that's a very, I'm not sure what words to use here. It's a very simplistic way of looking at something, and it brings fear into a position of trusting it. Well, what is the fear about? What we're suggesting is not changing your decision, but making it from a place of fullness, making it from a place of love and acceptance, rather than choosing something over what you are afraid of. The second thing is anytime you feel that there's a force or a push, lecture 77 is on self-confidence is the best lecture to read about forcing currents. That anytime you're in a forcing current, you're running away from something. What this lecture is trying to find what you're running away from so that you can turn around and examine it and get to know it, because you may have misinterpreted. When you're running away from something, you're not looking at it. Now, there's a difference between a forcing current and positive aggression.
Right, and that's what to me is challenging, is understanding that fine line and truly knowing which one you're doing.
Well, if you examine it and you're not running away from something, then unless something is being manifested, a conflict of some kind, why not just believe in yourself? So in other words, a forcing current will inevitably get you in trouble because it's a running away from disguised sometimes as running towards. Okay?
Right.
But positive aggression would only be present when you needed to push. And then when the need to push is no longer present, you would relax. Forcing currents don't relax.
Okay, so let me give you a hypothetical example based on what you just said to see if I'm kind of getting it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if there was somebody I was attracted to, positive aggression would be letting them know I'm interested.
Mm-hmm.
Forcing would be where they say not interested.
Yeah.
That's an example.
That would be a very good example, yes. So there are cases where people have had to step out from themselves, where they've had to be more forward or more open than they are comfortable being, because otherwise they don't get noticed by the other person.
Right.
And that you can make mistakes when you do that. So if you take yourself out of your comfort zone and put yourself in a situation where you're very uncomfortable, where you're somewhat ignorant, you're not familiar, you're not feeling positive about yourself, very likely you can make a mistake. And yet, that may be the only way you alert the other person to your level of interest. Now, from a unitive place, if you do that and you drop your fork, and they look at you and say, ooh, yuck, she dropped her fork, that's probably not your guy in the first place. Okay? Because if you drop a fork when you're nervous, you're going to do that on other occasions. So it's actually, when you step out of your comfort zone and you are awkward, isn't that what romantic comedies are all about? People behaving imperfectly, and yet finding that they rather like each other anyway.
And can you go back to the beginning of the lecture when you were talking about when we see repetitive things or we're attracted to something that is perhaps good or not good for us? Can you, it was very, very interesting to me. It was the first time I had ever heard of it.
Okay.
Heard of this particular way of looking at something. I was wondering if you could just reiterate on the concept of that, of being able to perceive something differently.
Okay. Now there's...
Do you know what I'm talking about? It was when you first started the lesson with, you see, I didn't grasp the whole thing. That's why I can't explain it intelligently.
That's okay. There's two possibilities here, and I'll name them both. Okay? What the guide was saying was there were two reasons for dualistic thinking. Okay? One is to actually believe in duality, to buy the story. But the other way to fall into dualistic thinking is to attempt to bring the unitive to this planet full-time.
Yeah, it's the second one.
Right. So that sounds like a positive when it's actually a negation. Okay? So, for instance, all our representations of God in statue form are to some degree silly. Okay, as if anybody knows what God looks like. Okay, but we like symbols and we like to look at things, so artists and societies can't help but try to give a focal point. Okay, and they try to bring that focal point into alignment with their values, so that when they look at the thing, they feel the feelings of looking at God. Okay?
Yeah.
But that can't be real. God can't be in stone. God can't be oils on canvas. God is too big for that. The unitive is like that. It's too big. The unitive does not have carpet that shows coffee stains. Okay? The unitive does not have imperfect people with personality problems trying to work out their distortions. Okay?
Right, so when you gave the example before about a person who grew up with a messy household, and for that person, the messy household was their order. Someone who grew up in an orderly home saw the mess as a mess, not as realization of what we are, or it's our perception.
Yes, it is our perception. I'm going to separate these two subjects. Okay, so let me tie off the one to go to the second. So when we are insistent on the unitive, where that connect with the story about somebody being messy and somebody being orderly, is that one of them would feel that there was a right way and a wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, they're saying the right way is what the unitive would do if it were here. Those may be awkward words. But when we say the right way from a spiritual perspective, we're trying to say God's way. But when you say God's way and you talk about clutter in a cupboard, this is silly. Okay, God doesn't have cupboards.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're doing is we're attempting to make the unitive obey the laws of nature, the laws of gravity, Newton's laws. But the unitive doesn't do that. The unitive just is. So what the guide is referring to is that when we insist on the unitive and we become angry or to some extent dysfunctional with the duality of human existence on the earth plane, we are actually being dualistic. They aren't separate. They are the same. They are part and parcel of each other, not distinct.
Yeah.
And when we try to make them distinct, such as, I wish I could die because then I would be in a holy place, and right now I'm in the middle of a street and that's not holy. Who says that's not holy? Who says you're not doing God's work by walking down the street?
So that's where coming in and walking the middle, going the middle path,
Mm-hmm.
it neutralizes the and or, the good, bad, the right, wrong.
Right. Mm-hmm. So one of the exercises that you can do in your personal life, and I tease about this being a spiritual practice because you got to practice, is one of the things you can do is notice all the little tiny dualities in your life and try to put an and in there. That's actually hard work. We all have fixed prejudices. We all have places in our lives where we believe this is the way it ought to be. Okay? And that's why I read the thing from AD 6, is in the smallest as well as the greatest parts of your life, if you are unwilling to address a fixed prejudice, prejudice meaning prejudged, I have already decided that this is right or wrong, good or bad, life-affirming or deadly. If I'm not willing to look at it, and the guide says you're not being asked to give it up or change your mind. But when you say, I won't look at it, the question would be, why? Why would you not examine? So the question before was, how do you tell the difference between a forcing current and positive aggression? Because positive aggression, even if it's turned on a little bit longer than it needs to be turned on, doesn't mind you turning it off. Forcing currents won't be turned off. You see, they're running away from death. Positive aggression is simply corralling some energy and force to move through something. And once the movement is made, you stand up, you dust yourself off and look around saying, okay, I did that, now what can I do? But a forcing current to some degree is still running. I have a body sense of a lot of these concepts. Some people feel it in their body, and some people are more intellectual, and some people feel it in their heart. But I have a kinesthetic sense. And I just have this feeling that something's back there chasing me. That's how I sense it. Well, that's not positive aggression. That's not moving towards something. That's moving away from something. But one of the reasons this work is a little hard perhaps harder than other disciplines, is I can't tell you how to do it. What I can suggest is that there are different techniques for discovering whether you're in a forcing current or whether that was simple positive aggression. I can offer techniques of making these 2-column pages for you to look at an attitude and see, are you really affirming life or are you trying to avoid death? And in the helpership training that I did, you have to learn a little bit by rote when you start, so it's handy to have a list. And they'd give you a list called the 15 steps. And they were very, very useful to get you started when you weren't used to looking for things. But number 1 on the list was to look for dualistic thinking. When somebody comes to you and says, I have a problem, and you say, what is your problem? What would you like help with? And the person says, that person is a problem. Well, now we have dualistic thinking. Instantaneous. Instead of, there's an issue that I want to discuss, and this is an element of it, we've already identified the person responsible. So this person would not be looking at all angles. They've already identified the culprit, and they want you to help. Let's fix him, and then I will be okay. That is the genesis of a lot of interpersonal conflict. A refusal to see... Pardon?
Global conflict.
Yes, that's quite true. And again, if you go global, while it may be true, it can be a little numbing sometimes to think in terms of global conflict. And one of the reasons I love the Patrick lectures so dearly is what I hear from the guide is that if you're called to do mediation for world peace, you go right ahead. But if I'm not called to run for office or become some big player in this, that doesn't mean I'm not doing my work and God's work. But what I do needs to be real, and it needs to be done passionately and with every fiber of my being. I may have a small part in the plan of salvation, but I have a part. And I accept that other people may have more visible roles, but that's only on this planet. From the unitive level, no one is more important than anyone else. So from a unitive place, if you feel that your role is in gardening, perhaps the people who see those flowers and who it uplifts their spirit and they walk along whistling and feeling better during the day, maybe your role is, not maybe, your role would be more key than you would realize. And that any analysis that says I'm not as important as someone else is to some degree dualistic thinking. It's dividing the world into movers and shakers and the rest of us. And on a unitive level, that's not true. That's what the guide says.
Thank you.
So are there any other questions? So I am learning that the teleconferences don't need to be as long as they have been. In the beginning I was preparing a lot of material, and I have a capacity to go on and on and on. So it's been suggested by a couple of people that an hour and a half is a very nice chunk of time, and that it would do quite nicely, thank you. So I'm going to let that happen. And I appreciate all of you being here and participating. It's a lot more fun for me to talk to real live human beings than just go on by myself. I sincerely appreciate your questions and appreciate them. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to email me. The next teleconference, I messed up on the invitations and sent out, anyway, January 17th is going to be about the function of the ego. And to some degree, it's a follow-up from Unity and Duality. So Unity Duality is kind of setting the stage for the unitive versus the earth plane, and how we can be on the earth plane and yet learn this middle ground. And the lectures on ego, specifically 132, the function of the ego, talk about what we need to be human beings in order to inhabit our spiritual task and really live the life we're meant to live on this planet. And that ego is a primary portion of that. It's a bit different than sometimes other spiritual philosophies present the ego to be. So that will be on the 17th. And thank you again for participating.
I just want to say, Ken, that sure helps those recordings. I don't seem to respond very much sometime in the initial presentation here, but going over it again certainly helps. So I'm going to send you an email about some of that.
Okay, that'd be fine. Glad to have it. So other than that, everybody have a very happy New Year, and hope to talk to you again on the 17th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jen. Bye.
You're very welcome.
Love, be still and know that I am God, that I am with you. Be still and feel that I am real in every light, in every shadow. Be still and know I never left your side, not since you said goodbye and wandered off through the dark and forgot your way home. Oh, love, be still and know that I am God, that I am with you. Be still and hear that I am near. Your every breath, that's what I